Welcome to Sleep Horror, where true horror stories will make your heart race. Once you've listened, tell me which story you loved the most by dropping a comment below. And don't forget to subscribe so I can bring you more episodes. The title of the story: The Whispering Walls of Ravensbrook Hall. Olivia Carter had never been one for superstition. As a 29-year-old architectural photographer from the United States, her job required her to capture the beauty in decay, ruins of ancient estates, forgotten castles, and crumbling manors scattered across the world. When the opportunity arose for her to photograph Ravensbrook Hall, a decaying Jacobean manor in Whitby, England, she jumped at the chance. The hall had long been abandoned, its stone walls crumbling beneath the weight of time. But the village locals were strangely quiet when she asked about it. The whispers about Ravensbrook Hall were hushed, their meanings vague, but the photos would be stunning, she thought. She arrived at dusk. The sea mist clung to the air, creeping along the cliffs like a fog of forgotten memories. The manor loomed above her, its jagged silhouette against the fading orange light, a stark contrast to the otherwise calm landscape. It looked like something out of a forgotten story, its stone walls weathered by centuries of wind and rain. The moss-covered gargoyles atop the turrets seemed to watch her with lifeless eyes, and the wooden door, half rotted by the years, creaked in protest as she pushed it open.
Inside, the air was thick with the musty odor of damp stone, and the silence was unnerving. A faint breeze stirred the dust in the corners of the room, and the sound of the wind whistling through broken mullioned windows created an eerie, mournful tone. It was a place steeped in forgotten history, and for a moment Olivia stood still, taking it all in. She pulled out her camera, the soft click of the shutter breaking the silence. As she ventured deeper into the manor, her boots echoed on the wooden floors, their creaks and groans adding to the ambient noise of the wind outside. The hallways stretched long before her, lined with cracked portraits of long-dead ancestors whose eyes seemed to follow her every move. The walls were covered in peeling wallpaper, faded to the point where the once luxurious patterns were now unrecognizable. She was capturing the decay, the haunting beauty of it all, but something felt off, like the building itself was holding its breath, waiting. A faint sound reached her ears, a soft tapping, like footsteps echoing from a distant hallway. She stopped, listening. The house was empty, she knew that. The village had told her no one had lived here for decades, and yet the sound persisted. She shook her head, blaming it on the creaking of the old structure, but the feeling of unease remained, gnawing at the edges of her thoughts.
The deeper she went into the manor, the more unsettling things became. Shadows flickered at the edge of her vision, moving in ways that didn't make sense. The air grew colder despite the warmth of her lantern, and an inexplicable chill crawled down her spine. She brushed it off as a draft, the inevitable consequence of an old building.
But the feeling didn't fade. Instead, it grew stronger. The floorboards groaned beneath her feet, as if the house itself was shifting, settling, no, moving. She turned a corner and found herself in front of a narrow wooden door, half hidden by a heavy velvet curtain. The door was different from the others. It was solid, unmarked, and locked with an old iron bolt. There was something about it, an inexplicable pull that urged her to open it. She hesitated, then shrugged off her apprehension, pushing the bolt aside with a creak that seemed too loud for the quiet of the manor. The room beyond was small and dark, the only light coming from her lantern. She stepped inside, her footfalls muffled by the thick layer of dust that covered the floor. The air felt heavy, stagnant, as if it hadn't been disturbed in years. The walls were adorned with strange carvings, figures twisted in unnatural positions, their eyes hollow and their expressions frozen in agony. Olivia felt a shiver crawl up her spine as she took in the scene, the flickering light of her lantern casting long, jagged shadows that seemed to writhe along the walls. Then she saw it. At the far end of the room, in the corner, near a cracked window, stood a figure, a woman. She was pale, almost ghostly, with hollow eyes that gleamed with an otherworldly light. Her expression was one of deep sorrow. Her lips parted as though she were about to speak, but no sound came. For a moment, Olivia stood frozen, staring at the figure, unable to move. The air was thick with tension, and the hairs on the back of her neck stood on end. The woman's head tilted slightly, as if recognizing Olivia, and then, in a swift motion, she moved. The floorboards creaked, the sound of her feet dragging along the old wood. Olivia's breath caught in her throat. She backed away, but her feet seemed to move slower than her mind, as if the air around her was thick with some invisible force. She reached for the door, her fingers trembling as she fumbled with the handle, but it wouldn't budge. The figure was coming closer, her hollow eyes locked on Olivia with an intensity that made her heart race. "No!" Olivia whispered, her voice barely audible. But it was. The woman stepped into the light, her form shifting, becoming more solid with every step. Olivia's mind raced, trying to understand what was happening, but the truth struck her like a bolt of lightning. The woman wasn't just a ghost. She wasn't some lost soul wandering the halls of the manor. She was a reflection of herself. Her pale skin, her hollow eyes, the same sorrowful expression. The realization hit her with a sickening force. She was trapped in the manor like the woman before her, forever lost to time. A voice whispered from the shadows, "Olivia." She spun around, heart pounding in her chest. The whisper came again, closer this time, and her name seemed to echo from every direction. She stumbled backward, fear gripping her with icy fingers. The walls seemed to close in on her, the shadows deepening, pulling her into the dark.
The woman's face was inches from hers now, her cold breath brushing Olivia's cheek. She tried to scream, but her voice caught in her throat. She ran. She ran through the hallways, her lantern swinging wildly in her hand, the light casting grotesque shadows against the walls. The whispering grew louder, more urgent, as though the house itself was calling her name. The door, the exit, was in sight, but as she reached for the handle, she stopped. The woman was there again, standing in the doorway, her eyes fixed on Olivia with an eerie intensity.
Olivia's heart raced in her chest, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She turned to run the other way, but the house seemed to stretch on forever, the hallways twisting and turning, never leading to freedom. The whispering grew louder, more insistent, until it drowned out everything else. And then, just as quickly as it had started, it stopped. The manor was silent once more. Olivia stood in the middle of the hallway, her body trembling with exhaustion and fear. She turned, looking over her shoulder, but there was no sign of the woman, no sound, no movement. But as she turned back to the hallway, she heard it, a whisper, so soft it was barely a breath against her ear. Olivia. And then nothing.
The title of the story was The Whispers of Saint-Armand. The wind howled as Ethan Brooks pulled his collar tighter against the frigid October air. The small riverside village of Saint-Armand, Quebec, lay before him like a forgotten relic from another time. As he walked, his boots crunching against the frost-covered cobblestones, he couldn't help but feel the weight of history pressing in on him. The dark spires of the Saint-Armand Seminary loomed in the distance, its silhouette jagged and forlorn against the gun-metal sky. The building had stood there for a century, its stone walls worn by the elements and the passage of time. For Ethan, a graduate student from Boston studying architectural acoustics, this decaying structure represented a goldmine of research on the sound dynamics of abandoned buildings. The village, however, seemed eager to keep its secrets. The elderly residents he'd spoken to earlier in the day had eyed him with an unspoken warning, their words chosen carefully and their gazes lingering just a little too long. "Be careful around that place, young man," one of them had said. "Saint-Armand Seminary is haunted, they say." Ethan smiled politely, dismissing the superstition. He was a man of science, after all, and ghosts didn't belong in his world. As he approached the seminary's entrance, a rusted iron gate creaked as if protesting his presence. The air was thick with a dampness that seemed to settle into his bones. The massive stone archway was covered in creeping ivy, and moss had taken root in the cracks of the old walls. Ethan stepped inside, his breath coming out in visible puffs, the cold biting at his skin.
The interior was just as bleak. The scent of wet stone and decay filled the air, and the sound of his footsteps echoed eerily in the cavernous space.
The grandiose architecture that once symbolized power and reverence now stood in ruin. Peeling wallpaper, broken stained glass windows, and sagging beams that gave the building a sense of quiet desperation. Yet, despite the desolation, the space still held a certain grim majesty. Ethan set his backpack down in the entryway and pulled out his equipment, beginning to take measurements and notes. As he explored, he was struck by the silence. It was unsettling. The only sound was the occasional distant toll of a long decommissioned church bell, its echo reverberating through the halls, though no one had rung it in decades. Ethan moved deeper into the building, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. The grand hallway stretched before him, filled with shadows that seemed to twist unnaturally in the light. Every step felt like an intrusion into something long forgotten. But it was in the west wing, near the collapsed chapel, where things started to take a turn. It began with the sound of footsteps. Faint at first, they echoed down the corridor behind him, quick and light, as though someone were walking just out of sight. Ethan stopped and turned around, the beam of his flashlight dancing nervously across the old wooden floors. Nothing. Only the empty hallway stretched back into the darkness. He chalked it up to the building settling, the creaks of ancient wood under the weight of 100 years. But the footsteps continued, always behind him, always just a step or two away.
A chill ran down his spine as he moved forward again, trying to shake off the growing sense of unease. His breath fogged in front of him, and his pulse quickened. Then he saw it. A shadow, fleeting but unmistakable, darting across the wall of a nearby room. It was too fast to be a person, too fluid, too unnatural. Ethan's heart raced as his curiosity pushed him forward. He rounded the corner and entered a large, dark chamber. The cold air inside seemed even more biting, as if the room itself was holding its breath. Dust particles danced in the faint light, but it was the far corner of the room that caught his attention. A heavy oak door stood ajar, leading to a small stairwell descending deeper into the building. It was odd. Ethan had studied the architecture of the seminary before his arrival and knew this part of the structure wasn't listed in any of the plans. He hesitated for a moment, but the lure of discovery proved too strong. With a flick of his wrist, he pushed the door open further and began his descent. The steps creaked under his weight, and the air grew colder with each step. Down, down he went, until he reached the bottom of the stairs, where an old chapel lay hidden from the rest of the building. The sight before him was jarring. Candles, unlit but still present, lined the edges of the room, and the faint smell of old incense lingered in the air. The altars had collapsed, its stone base broken into jagged pieces. Dust hung thick in the air, and the faintest traces of mold were visible in the corners. But it was the far wall that drew his attention. The stone was cracked, revealing a narrow passageway behind it.
Ethan approached cautiously, his heart racing in his chest. He ran his hand over the rough stone, feeling the jagged edges of the crack. After a moment's hesitation, he pushed against the wall. It shifted easily, and a faint draft rushed through the new opening. Inside was a small chamber, dimly lit, its walls lined with crumbling books and religious artifacts. But there was something else. At the center of the room stood a statue, its features worn smooth by time, but Ethan could still make out the faint outline of a woman. She stood with her hands clasped in prayer, her face frozen in eternal reverence. Beneath her, etched into the stone floor, was a name, Sister Marie. Ethan's heart skipped a beat. The villagers had spoken of a nun who had perished in the fire, a young woman named Marie, who had been trapped in the chapel when the flames engulfed the building. She was said to have been abandoned by the other occupants of the seminary, left to die alone. A soft sound, almost a whisper, caused Ethan to freeze in place. His eyes scanned the room, but no one was there. Then came another whisper, this time louder. It sounded like a name, Ethan. He spun around, but the room was still empty. The whispers continued, now surrounding him, and he felt a presence, cold and oppressive, pressing in on him. He backed away from the statue, the whispers growing louder with every step. His pulse thundered in his ears as he turned and bolted back toward the stairs, but something caught his foot. He stumbled, falling to the floor, his flashlight spinning out of his hands. When he looked up, he saw her. The pale, ghostly figure of a young nun stood at the top of the stairs, her hollow eyes locked onto his. Her once white habit was now tattered and singed, as if scorched by fire. Her mouth moved, but no sound emerged. Ethan scrambled to his feet, his mind racing. The whispers were deafening now, their urgency building as the spirit floated toward him, her face contorted with agony. He turned and ran, but the sound of his own name, Ethan, echoed from all around him, as if the walls themselves were calling to him. He stumbled through the abandoned halls, his breath ragged and his heart pounding in his chest. When he reached the front doors, they wouldn't budge. The spirit was closing in. And then, just as quickly as it began, it all stopped. The building fell silent again, the whispers fading into nothingness. Ethan stood there, trembling, staring at the door. He had to leave. He needed to leave. Finally, the door opened, as if by some unseen force, and he fled into the night, the cold air cutting into his skin. But as he looked back at the seminary, his breath catching in his throat, he heard it again. A whisper, soft but unmistakable. Ethan. He turned to run, but the shadows of Saint-Armand still clung to him, even as he escaped into the night. The title of the story, The Whispers Beneath, Ravensbrook. I never believed in ghosts until I saw her reflection in the mirror at the stroke of midnight. I'm Olivia Carter, a 29-year-old architectural photographer from Boston. My work centers around capturing the eerie beauty of abandoned places, crumbling estates, decaying castles, forgotten temples. Some might call it morbid, but I found a strange sort of peace in the quiet of these neglected places where time seemed to freeze and history lingered in the shadows. My latest assignment, however, would prove to be more than I bargained for. It was late autumn when I arrived in Whitby, a coastal town in northern England, my camera gear in tow. A thick fog hung low over the cliffs as I made my way toward Ravensbrook Hall, a Jacobean manor perched on the edge of a steep precipice. The locals avoided the topic of the manor when I asked about it, offering nothing but wary glances and half-spoken warnings. The words they did speak hinted at something dark, a history tangled in tragedy and loss. But I wasn't in Whitby to hear stories. I was here to capture the beauty of decay. Ravensbrook was just as the townspeople had described. Towering stone walls covered in creeping ivy, windows boarded up like they were hiding some terrible secret. The house looked abandoned, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me as I stepped through the rusted gates and into the overgrown yard. The front door creaked loudly as I pushed it open, revealing the shadows within. The interior of Ravensbrook was a testament to its age. The walls were damp, covered in layers of peeling paint. The air smelled of mildew, must, and stone, thick with the kind of forgotten history that only old houses seem to hold. A faint draught whispered through the cracked windows, causing the lantern light I held in my hand to flicker and cast twisted shadows across the cracked stone floors. The silence of the place was deafening, broken only by the distant creak of beams and the occasional thud of something unseen shifting in the walls. I moved through the manor slowly, taking photos of the decaying furniture, the faded tapestries, the broken staircases leading up to nothing. Each room seemed to hold more dust than the last, more forgotten memories, more ghosts of lives that had once been lived here. But it wasn't until I reached the hallway leading toward the chapel when things began to feel wrong. At first it was small things, whispers in the wind, as though the house itself were trying to speak. I paused, listening, but the wind had died down. The sound of creaking floorboards echoed in the distance, though I was certain I was alone. The shadows shifted too, growing deeper, as if the manor were alive, breathing in the dark. My heart began to race, but I told myself it was just my imagination, just the weight of the history in the house weighing on me. Then came the first real sign, the flicker of a pale silhouette, barely visible out of the corner of my eye. I whipped my head toward the figure, but it was gone, leaving only the empty hall behind. My breath caught in my throat, but I quickly brushed it off as a trick of the light or a fleeting reflection. But then it happened again and again. Each time the figure appeared for just a moment, always on the edge of my vision, always slipping away before I could fully see it. My pulse quickened, and the air felt heavier with each step I took deeper into the house. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, until I could almost hear my name carried on the wind. Olivia, Olivia. I reached the chapel door, my heart hammering in my chest. The door opened with an eerie groan, revealing a room that had been left to rot, its stone pews covered in dust and mold. A large hearth sat at one end of the room, but the fire was long dead. On the mantel above the hearth, something caught my eye, a portrait. At first, I thought it was just another relic of the past, a forgotten piece of the manor's history. But as I drew closer, the chill that ran down my spine told me something was terribly wrong. The woman in the painting was unfamiliar, yet there was something hauntingly familiar about her. Her dark eyes, her pale skin, her delicate features, they looked like mine. The resemblance was uncanny. I stepped back, my heart racing as I stared at the painting. How could this be? Was it some strange coincidence, or had I somehow found a picture of a long-forgotten ancestor? But no, it wasn't just the eyes or the face. It was everything. Her expression, her posture, the way she seemed to watch me, as though she had known me, as though she was waiting for me. And that was when the truth hit me. The woman in the painting, she was me. I took a step back, my breath shallow. How could this be? I wasn't from Whitby. I wasn't even English. There was no way I could have a portrait in this house, painted centuries ago. And yet, there it was, staring back at me, with eyes that seemed to follow my every movement. The whispers grew louder, rising in volume until they filled the room. Olivia, Olivia, come closer. The lantern in my hand flickered violently, casting the shadows into chaotic dance. For a split second, I thought I saw the woman in the portrait move, her lips curving into a faint, knowing smile. My heart skipped a beat. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. And then, as if the very walls of the manor had finally given up their secrets, the figure appeared before me, stepping out from the darkened corner of the room. It was her, standing in front of me, her pale face illuminated by the dim light of the lantern. But this wasn't just a reflection. This was a living, breathing woman. My own face, twisted with sorrow, reached toward me from the shadows. I stumbled back, my pulse pounding in my ears. The air grew colder, the walls seemed to close in, and then, with a voice that echoed through the entire manor, she spoke,
her voice my own, but hollow, distant. "You're not meant to be here. Ravensbrook is mine, and now it's yours." I wanted to scream, but my throat had gone dry. My mind reeled with the impossible truth. But before I could process it, the lantern flickered once more, casting the room into complete darkness. When the light returned, the figure was gone. The whispers were gone. Only silence remained. But as I fled down the hallway, the cold wind howled behind me, and I heard my own name whispered through the dark. And somewhere, deep in the manor, I felt the cold fingers of the past clutching at me, pulling me closer to the place I was never meant to leave.
The title of the story is Echoes of Ravensbrook Hall. Olivia Carter stood at the foot of the jagged cliffs, gazing up at Ravensbrook Hall. The Jacobean manor loomed above her, shrouded in an eerie fog that seemed to rise from the sea itself, curling around the stone structure like a living thing. She was no stranger to abandoned estates. In fact, she had made a name for herself as an architectural photographer specializing in forgotten places. But this felt different. There was something about the manor that seemed to exude a malevolent energy, something ancient and unresolved. The damp air clung to her skin as she slung her camera bag over her shoulder and stepped toward the large iron gate. The soft tolling of a distant church bell reverberated through the fog, marking the hour as the mist seemed to swallow the world around her. Whitby, the small coastal town she had passed through earlier, was already far behind. She had come to document the decay of Ravensbrook Hall for a heritage magazine, but as her boots crunched against the overgrown gravel path, she couldn't shake the feeling that the manor had been waiting for her. Ravensbrook Hall stood as a monument to ruin. Its weathered stone walls bore the scars of centuries, and the moss-covered gargoyles perched atop its towers seemed to be watching her, their eyes hollow and accusing. The manor was still magnificent in its way, but the decay was inescapable. The rotting beams, the cracked windows, the flickering light from her lantern that made the shadows on the walls twist and dance in unnatural ways. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of mildew, a sharp reminder of the building's abandonment. The grand foyer stretched before her, the faded tapestries lining the walls barely visible in the dim glow of her lantern. Olivia's footsteps echoed in the cavernous space, her breath shallow as she surveyed the ruin. She raised her camera, capturing the details, the crumbling stonework, the chipped wood, the forgotten beauty of the place. The manor had a history that was fading, and it was Olivia's job to preserve that history, to capture it before it crumbled entirely. But as she moved deeper into the heart of the house, Something unsettling began to settle in her chest. The silence was too deep, the stillness too perfect. It felt as though the manor was holding its breath, watching her every move. And then there it was, a creak, faint but distinct, coming from somewhere down the hall. Olivia froze, her lantern flickering as she strained to hear. Another creak. This time the sound was louder, as if someone had stepped onto the floorboards just ahead. She took a hesitant step forward, the light from her lantern casting a shaky glow across the long, narrow corridor. The floorboards creaked again, only this time she was certain that no one was there. A chill ran down her spine, but she forced herself to continue. The manor was old, and old houses had their sounds. Old houses creaked, but the feeling in the air, it was different. Olivia shook her head, trying to push the unease away. She raised her camera again, focusing on the details of a faded portrait hanging on the wall. The woman in the painting was regal, her expression proud, but her eyes seemed to follow Olivia's every movement. The portrait's colors had long since faded, the edges of the canvas curling with age, yet it felt as if the woman were still alive in the room, her presence as palpable as the dust in the air.
Turning away from the portrait, Olivia moved deeper into the manor. The hall stretched on, each room more desolate than the last. She passed through a library where the shelves were lined with books covered in a thick layer of dust, and into a drawing room with broken furniture scattered about as though the place had been abandoned in haste. Every step she took seemed to echo louder than the last, as though the house itself was holding its breath, waiting. And then, out of the corner of her eye, Olivia caught a fleeting movement, a pale figure, just for a moment, reflected in the tarnished mirror across the room. Her heart skipped a beat. She swung the lantern around, but the figure was gone. She moved toward the mirror, her breath shallow and her hands trembling slightly as she lifted the lantern to get a better look. The reflection revealed only the empty room behind her. But there was something in the mirror, something that hadn't been there before. A faint figure, standing in the shadows just beyond the reach of the lantern's light. It wasn't quite a person, yet it was not entirely a shadow. It was pale, gaunt, and featureless. Olivia's heart pounded in her chest as she backed away from the mirror, the air in the room growing colder with each passing second. The whispers came next, soft at first, like the rustling of old pages in a forgotten book. But the whispers grew louder, almost like a chorus, filling the empty room with their soft, indistinct murmurs. Olivia spun around, searching for the source, but there was nothing, no one. Her pulse quickened as the room seemed to close in on her.
She was no longer alone. The manor had awakened, and it was watching her, listening to every breath.
Her lantern flickered wildly, casting long, grotesque shadows across the walls. She stumbled back, nearly tripping over a chair, and that's when she saw it. A journal, half buried beneath a pile of old newspapers, its leather cover cracked with age. She knelt to pick it up, her hands shaking as she opened it to reveal the yellowed pages inside. The journal belonged to a woman named Eleanor Ravensbrook, the last of the manor's inhabitants, and as Olivia read, a cold realization began to settle in her bones. The manor had burned down a century ago, a tragedy that had claimed the lives of everyone inside. Eleanor had been one of the last to perish, her body never found, only her portrait remained. She had vanished in the flames, and yet Olivia's breath caught in her throat as she turned the page, finding a photograph of the woman in the portrait. It was Eleanor, except her eyes, dark and hollow, were staring back at Olivia. Her heart raced, and her hands trembled as she looked up at the portrait hanging on the wall. The eyes in the painting, they were hers. The woman in the mirror, the pale figure, it was her. Olivia stared at the image, unable to look away, as the whispers grew louder, as the air grew colder. The lantern flickered one last time, and Olivia's vision blurred. The whispers turned into a single clear voice. "You shouldn't have come." With a scream, she dropped the lantern and fled from the room, the sounds of the house closing in around her, the whispers following her down the hall. As she reached the front door, she could hear her name, soft and clear, whispered from the shadows. But when she turned, there was no one there. The fog had thickened outside, and as she ran down the path toward the gate, she couldn't shake the feeling that the manor was watching her, that the past of Ravensbrook Hall had followed her into the present, and somewhere, just beyond the fog, she could hear the faintest echo of the tolling bell.
The title of the story: The Whispers of Saint-Armand Seminary. The evening chill bit into Ethan Brooks's skin as he made his way through the desolate streets of Saint-Armand, a tiny village on the outskirts of Quebec. The wind howled down the empty roads, pushing him forward like a whisper, urging him to move faster. A graduate student from Boston, Ethan had come to this isolated spot for one purpose: research. He was studying the acoustics of abandoned buildings for his thesis, and the long-forgotten Saint-Armand Seminary, a decaying neo-Gothic structure, seemed the perfect subject. The village's few residents eyed him with suspicion, offering only fleeting glances as they hurried by, their hands tucked into their thick coats. As he approached the seminary, their whispered warnings echoed in his mind. "That place is cursed," one of the elderly villagers had muttered. "The souls of those who perished in the fire still haunt it." Ethan had smiled politely, dismissing their superstitions. Ghosts were nothing more than folklore, he told himself.
His camera equipment slung over his shoulder, he pressed on, eager to document the forgotten grandeur of the building for his academic work. The seminary loomed ahead, its silhouette dark against the gray sky. The spires reached into the mist like skeletal fingers, their stone faces worn and eroded by years of neglect. The heavy wooden doors groaned in protest as Ethan pushed them open, revealing the dark interior. The air inside was thick with the scent of charred wood and mildew, a reminder of the fire that had ravaged the building over a century ago. The stone walls, once grand and ornate, were now cracked and stained, their surfaces curling with age. A faint trace of incense lingered in the air, like a ghost of the past.
Ethan set up his camera equipment in the main hall, the beams of his flashlight cutting through the darkness. He had read about the fire that had destroyed the seminary, a tragedy sparked by the grief of a priest who had lost his family. The story was tragic, but it felt distant, like a myth. He wanted to capture the ruins, the history frozen in time. He wanted to study how sound reverberated in such an immense, crumbling space. The silence, however, was unnerving. The seminary seemed to exhale around him, its decaying stone walls almost alive with the weight of forgotten memories. At first, Ethan wrote it off as the building settling, natural sounds from an old structure. But as he moved deeper into the chapel, he began to notice subtle, inexplicable things. A whisper, soft but clear, slithered into his ears, though no one else was there. The sound of fabric brushing the stone floor. A tap, just one, faint but deliberate, echoed off the walls. His head snapped toward the source, but the room remained empty, save for the pews, their wood warped and stained by time. His pulse quickened, but he told himself it was the wind playing tricks on him. The flickering of the lights above, casting twisted shadows on the cracked stone floor, did little to calm his nerves. The flickers seemed unnatural, as if something unseen was controlling them. Ethan tried to shake off the feeling of unease, but the air around him grew colder, heavier. His breath hung in front of him, invisible puffs, as he continued to explore, his footsteps echoing unnervingly through the vast emptiness of the seminary. The chapel was in ruins, its altar half buried under soot and ash. A faded cross still stood, but it was covered in a thick layer of dust, as though it had been forgotten for a century. Ethan set his camera on the pew and wandered further into the building, following the path to the crypt beneath the chapel. The floor was slick with moisture, and the scent of decay grew stronger the further he descended into the depths.
The crypt was dark, the faint light from his flashlight casting eerie shadows against the walls. In the corner of the room, partially hidden beneath a pile of forgotten relics, he noticed something strange. A leather-bound diary, its pages yellowed and brittle with age. He picked it up, brushing off the dust. As he flipped through the pages, his eyes scanned the faded handwriting. The entries detailed the tragic events leading up to the fire. How a grieving priest, Father Maurice, had caused the blaze. His sorrow for the death of his family consuming him. In his grief, he had set fire to the seminary, believing that by destroying the building he would free the souls trapped inside. But the fire had claimed more lives than he ever intended, and many of the parishioners who had once worshipped there had perished in the flames. The final entry sent a chill down Ethan's spine. It spoke of a curse, a vow from Father Maurice that the souls lost in the fire would never find peace. The diary ended abruptly, as if the writer had been interrupted, and the last words were a chilling reminder: "The dead do not rest here." Ethan's breath caught in his throat as the temperature dropped further. The whispers that had been a faint murmur earlier now grew louder, more distinct. He spun around, his flashlight flickering as he scanned the crypt. For a moment he saw nothing, only the shadows dancing on the stone walls. But then a figure materialized in the doorway, a shadowy silhouette, tall and thin, its face obscured by darkness. Ethan's heart raced in his chest as the figure stepped forward, its hollow eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. The air around him seemed to pulse with an oppressive weight, as if the very walls were closing in on him.
His legs felt frozen, his feet rooted to the ground. The figure moved closer, and Ethan could hear the soft rasp of fabric, the sound of someone or something moving in the stillness. His mind screamed for him to run, but his body refused to obey. With a final desperate push, Ethan turned and bolted up the stairs, the figure's presence lingering at his heels. His breath came in ragged gasps, the sound of his footsteps echoing in the hollow chambers of the seminary. He ran through the chapel, the once peaceful space now transformed into a chamber of terror. His flashlight flickered and died, plunging him into darkness. He reached the front door, his hand trembling as he fumbled with the handle. When the door finally gave way, he stumbled out into the cold night air, gasping for breath. He turned to look at the seminary once last time, its dark silhouette looming over him. And then, from somewhere inside the building, he heard it, a voice, low and guttural, calling his name. "Ethan, Ethan, you cannot escape." The sound sent a shiver down his spine, and he ran without looking back. The whisper of the priest's voice lingered in his mind as he sprinted down the empty streets of Saint-Armand, the village swallowed by the fog. As he reached the edge of the village, Ethan dared a final glance over his shoulder. The seminary was gone. The mist had consumed it entirely, and in its place was only darkness, stretching into the unknown. And then, just as he turned away, the whisper returned, echoing in his mind. You can never escape.